Today's episode of Hidden Forces is made possible by listeners like you. For more information about this week's episode or for easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you listen to the show on your Apple Podcast app, remember, you can give us a review. Each review helps more people find the show and join our amazing community. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode. What's up, everybody? Today's episode features two guests who have each made one prior appearance on Hidden Forces, Grant Williams and Ben Hunt. Ben is the founder of the widely read Epsilon Theory, a newsletter and website that's become popular for its insights and analysis into markets and society, with a particular focus on how narrative drives our perception of the world and our place in it. Grant is a little harder to pin down. Literally, he's always traveling, but also creatively. He's the longtime publisher of a popular financial newsletter, hosts a phenomenal sports podcast called Are You Not Entertained? And his long-form conversations with fund managers, investors, economists, and other brilliant thinkers are some of the most engaging, thoughtful, and well-produced interviews you will find anywhere. Today's conversation is broken into two parts, the second hour of which is available to our paid subscribers. I know what you're thinking. Thank God I'm subscribed. Unless you're not, in which case there's an easy solution. Just scroll down to the bottom of this week's episode page and click on the link that says patreon.com/hidden forces. From there, if you already have a Patreon account, you just choose which content tier you want access to, and boom, you're done. If you don't have an account, you make one, which literally takes 50 seconds. I've done it. The subscription renews automatically on the first of every month, and if you ever run into a problem that Patreon's customer service cannot solve, you can always reach out to me. I bring you this show unfiltered, without sponsors and without commercial interruptions, because I want to spend every minute of my time on the things that matter most to you. By not taking a sponsor, I don't have to answer to anyone but you. I just go wherever my curiosity and the story takes me. And that's not something you can find easily these days. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode with my guests, Grant Williams and Ben Hunt. Grant Williams and Ben Hunt, welcome to Hidden Forces.
What a great little confluence of events this was.
Indeed, yeah. This was totally a last-minute kind of thing. It just came together.
Yeah, it was. Now you get to hear my kind of southern drawl and Grant, whatever that accent is.
My fake English accent.
Yeah.
I'm really from Sheboygan.
Both American and Anglo aristocracy.
Yeah. No, I'm really from Boston. I fake the Alabama accent, just like Grant fakes the...
Hilarious. You were just telling us that you rode down here on a John Deere tractor?
Oh, yeah.
How long did it take you to get here?
No, I did, 30 miles an hour. It took me a couple hours, but...
I was telling, but when you were in the bathroom, I was telling Ben that he's up in this great secluded area in the woods in a farm with his food supply and everything, and he decided to come down in the infestation of coronavirus in New York City.
Yeah,
but actually, you're the one that lives in Singapore.
No.
Not anymore.
I've been in Singapore for a while, thankfully, and I haven't been to Asia for a while, and so I should be virus free. If I'm not, I'm going to blame one of you two guys. So I know where to start.
What do you guys? I mean, we have so many things to discuss. I've put together a wide range of topics. So what are your thoughts on this coronavirus? It should dominate the news cycle.
Yeah, listen, I'm going to defer to Ben here because I've watched this thing happen and all the comments, and I haven't tweeted or retweeted any of it because I have no idea, right? And you wrote the single bit, literally the only piece that I've retweeted about it, and so you should talk about this because it's the best thing I've read about it, frankly.
Well, thanks. Every once in a while, I know you've had this feeling too once or more than once, right? That you write something that hits the zeitgeist at just the right time.
Yeah.
And so I wrote this note called Body Count, and what it's comparing the coronavirus narrative to, because, that's what I focus on, the narrative of what's happening. It just hit me over the weekend that I've lived this before. And I lived this before when I was 6, 7 years old, and you're watching the nightly news, the CBS News with Walter Cronkite.
Right.
And, Grant's of an age where he can, appreciate this. Every night on this little black and white TV set, you were told with perfect specificity exactly how many American soldiers had been killed and wounded or taken prisoner in the Vietnam War, exactly how many South Vietnamese soldiers had been killed or wounded, and exactly how many North Vietnamese soldiers had been killed or wounded. Now, I think the data was probably pretty good for the Americans. It was in the right ballpark for the South Vietnamese. It was a complete fiction for the North Vietnamese. And yet, every night, the number was reported with total specificity. The reason being is that this was how the United States government wanted to win the war at home, right? Because the common knowledge, what everyone knew, was that we were winning the war in Vietnam. How? Why? Well, didn't you see the body count numbers?
They're going to run out of people.
Right. Yeah. That's right. They're on the verge of giving up, right? We're winning the hearts and minds of people because, we would have a soldier or two killed and they'd have 200 killed on that day, or 203, right? It was always very specific. In fact, what was going on, and this is what I mean about the tail wagging the dog, the tail of creating this narrative at home actually drove or wagged the dog of our war-fighting policy in Vietnam. So our policy became one of what they would call search and destroy missions, where the goal was to send, a Marine platoon or two out into the jungle to go pacify a village, kill some North Vietnamese, some NVA soldiers, count them. And so the counting became the war fighting. The tail really did wag the dog, and it was responsible, I really think, for not just the atrocities that were committed, the My Lai incident and the others, but it made for poor war fighting. Right? We didn't win that war, I think, in large part because we were fighting with more than an eye, but with a total focus on maintaining the narrative at home rather than effectively prosecuting the war on the ground. So it struck me that what we were hearing from China was exactly like I heard when I was a 6 and 7 year old boy from Walter Cronkite about these specific numbers of new cases for the day and how many people had died. So it got me thinking, well, let's look at the numbers, because I don't believe anyone has a real world signal or metric for what's really happening in what the spread of the disease really is in Wuhan and the Hubei province or the other towns that have been under quarantine. There is no data that I can look at and say, aha, here's the right answer. But here's what I can do. I can see the numbers that are being reported to us. I can analyze those numbers statistically, and I can tell you that it is more likely that the sun will go nova tonight and burn us to a crisp than that those numbers that are being reported are the actual numbers that would come out from an exponentially expanding virus with quarantine and treatment facilities, right? The numbers that were being reported, I don't know what the real numbers are, but I can tell you that those numbers were constructed, were fake. And that was the note I wrote, and it has gone, I think, pretty viral now. And, and then yesterday we had the Chinese government come out with a new set of numbers. And it's not because they're saying, oh, we found more cases. It's just that, oh, we're trying out a different methodology here. So it just shows that these numbers are all constructed. They're all lies, which shouldn't surprise any of us when we think about all the other numbers that we get out of China, right? But for some reason, we were taking the coronavirus numbers as gospel.
But they were comfortable numbers for us to read, right?
They were comfortable numbers, scary, and they were reported by the World Health Organization, right? You had this imprimatur, this missionary, this source of authority who vouched for the Chinese numbers. And that's as much of I think, the tragedy of what's going on and how indicative it is this world where it's what, Grant, I know you've talked about this too, it's fiat world.
Yeah.
It's not just our money is fiat money. It's not just printed. Our world is constructed for us, where opinions are made up out of whole cloth and presented to us as fact. And this was just a very straightforward case of where you could say, look, I can show you statistically, like I say, it's impossible for these numbers to be real.
Right. But that's isn't that all you need though, right? You don't need to know what the right numbers are. You just need to be able to prove that the ones you're being given are incorrect. And then the game should be up to you. You realize that you're being played.
But yes, it's absolutely, I think, without a doubt that we're being played. What that leaves open, though, to your original question of, what do you guys think about this? And am I stocking up on, whatever it is, N73 masks? Right?
Don't
Yeah,
stock
no.
up on
I'm talking about the actual, mask that can actually, insulate from a virus, right? Am I stocking up on those $100 masks? I'm not, because I don't know what the actual spread of the disease is.
Yeah.
We don't know, because what we are being told is a lie, and we don't have access to any independent source of verification of what it really is.
It's interesting because one of the things that has been missing has been any sort of remotely detailed description of what the symptoms are, what the virus is. Have you noticed that? You might have gone digging
it's crazy.
for it and
so,
found it.
and this is all part of the, I'll say, the penumbra, meaning the shadows around this virus. Almost immediately, the Chinese government released the entire genome of the, novel coronavirus 2019, or COVID-19, whatever they're calling it right these days. So we know exactly what it is, right? Because we have the freaking genetic sequence of this virus. So in that sense, we know so much about it. And in the other sense, the sense you're describing, what are the clinical attributes of
what
this
does it mean to be
disease?
sick?
Right.
With this
What does it
virus?
mean to be sick with this virus? How does it present itself, and all the real world characteristics of the disease? You're absolutely right. We just don't know. It's why I actually find your old stomping ground, Singapore, to be really interesting in this.
Yes,
because
it is interesting.
I think, frankly, they have been quite transparent
Mm-hmm.
and very good at presenting, okay, here are the 60 cases that we know about. Here's how we've tracked it down to different clusters. Here are the 10 cases where we can't identify any cluster. Of course, those are the ones that give you the most pause.
Yeah.
Because it's local, it's spread locally, but we don't know how or through what sort of mechanism. So that's what's keeping everyone up awake at night, right? So we're really relying on the small number of cases outside of China for any sort of transparent data on, as you say, how does the disease present itself and live, in humans.
I'd just go back to bookend that discussion, going back to the Vietnam War. Vietnam is a spectacular country and fantastic people. It's just one of my favorite places on earth. And I went there a number of years ago, and I went to Hanoi.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a war museum in Hanoi.
Yep.
And you go there, and it's spectacular. It's like a 5th grade science project. It's handwritten signs and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But what they have as exhibits, the rifle with which a certain private shot down 5 enemy bombers,
right,
and the rusty spoon,
right,
which a private killed 300 American GIs with that stormed his trench and stuff. So it works both ways. And
of course,
that's
it
just
does.
how it happens, right? It's we don't know the numbers, and we kind of can't know the numbers, because you look at some of the people panicking already about this thing. I understand why they fear letting the real numbers out into the public, but there is a tipping point where it's less constructive to be so closed about it and so bald-faced false about it.
And this is the thing, Grant, and again, this is something that you and I have talked a lot about, and I know, Dimitri, and some of the stuff you've written, it's a similar idea. This is what the best and the brightest, to use David Halberstam's term for the American decision makers in the Vietnam War, this is what the best and the brightest always do. They think that we, the people, can't handle the truth.
Yep.
That we're either too stupid, that we're too easily frightened. And so what the best and the brightest always do is they construct a story. It's a very carefully formulated communication policy, right? Where they believe, and I believe this is sincere, that they think we just need more time. We can buy time to win the real world war by constructing this story that we know is false, and so that we don't get pressure domestically to do something that would be, we think, counterproductive to what we think is to winning the war. But what always happens, again, this is what happened in the Vietnam War. This is absolutely what I think has happened with central bank monetary policy, because it's direct corollary. It's that, again, the tail wags the dog, that you create this monster, right, of the narrative and the story around your monetary policy, or your prosecution of a war in Vietnam, or your handling of the coronavirus in China. And it takes over. The monster takes over because you realize we can't change the story. We're now a prisoner to the story we've created. And so we now have to prosecute the war, prosecute our monetary policy, or prosecute our quarantine policy, driven by this narrative that we've created.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what always happens, and it always ends in tears.
It's interesting because, well, a couple of things. One, just to reiterate or touch back on something we were discussing about the lack of description of the symptoms, or what it actually means to be sick. What is this coronavirus? You see these people in China, or videos of people spraying on the streets, and it's almost kind of like it's again this mystery virus. You don't know what it is. But to this point about having this one alternate reality, which is the narrative, and then the underlying reality, and what happens when these diverge, and how do you bring them into balance? I guess, how do you do that? Like, for example, the Chinese now are trying to do that by introducing new statistics. You're saying those statistics are not necessarily any closer to reality. They're just trying to, so. I
think they probably are closer to reality because they're higher. So,
exactly.
So I think they are closer to reality, but I think they are equally as constructed. That's the main point here.
Well, one of the things in your analogy, you brought up Vietnam. That was a time when the consensus view of reality, or the authoritative view of reality, was much more readily believed, right?
Yes.
And we go through these periods. It seems that the most recent is maybe now or after the 2008 financial crisis. I think that was a period. We also saw stuff like this in the 1970s, and I only know about this because in the 2008-2009 period, a lot of stuff from the 70s was coming back out through the internet. So you can see there always are these periods where the narrative breaks down and you get all these counter narratives. And where I'm going with this is that in the period of 2008-2009, a lot of these counter narratives had much more credibility, I think, than they do today. Today, it just seems like the entire landscape is full of disinformation. You can't seem to trust anything anymore. Whereas like in the 2008-2009 period, you felt like if you were reading Zero Hedge, you were kind of had a leg up on what was going on. You know what I mean?
Well,
Does that make sense? Does that resonate at all?
You go ahead, Grant. I've got lots of thoughts, but
no, I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that social media has enabled is the ability to be a conspiracy theorist amongst your brethren, right? In the 60s, that wasn't possible. You're just a crazy guy with a tinfoil hat on. Now you can go out there and you can put these crazy conspiracy theories online, and you will find your tribe. You'll find your pack. They're out there.
That's also problematic.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Right,
because
I can say something like, I'll give a quick example, right? So the United States has a bioweapons lab that's 45 miles outside of Washington, D.C. It's Fort Detrick, right? They used to call it our biowar facility, right? They changed the name.
Funny that.
Right? So now it's, biodefense, right? But it's the same program. It's the same everything.
Same thing with the Defense Department. It used to be the Department of
War. Right, right. So I've been to Fort Detrick. And it's an amazing place with amazing people. And I'm confident that they are, working for the defense of our country. But it is a bioweapons lab. That's what Fort Detrick is, right? And look, if we had an outbreak of a new disease in Washington, D.C., and we were told that the animal population vector for this new disease was, let's say, feral cats.
Yeah.
And we also knew that research on feral cats was a major program at Fort Detrick. It's not crazy to ask questions about that.
Absolutely
it's not crazy to ask questions about that. And So replace feral cats with bats, replace, the Fort Detrick with the Wuhan, biolab, right?
Facility.
Right. And
is that the largest bioweapons facility in China?
Well, I'm not going to call it bioweapons, right?
I've heard this also. I'm just asking, like, right? It's or bio research or whatever it is.
It's the only, what they call it, biosafety level 4 facility in China. The only one.
Right.
Right. There are, 4 or 5 here in the States. Fort Detrick is one, right? But it's the only one. It's the only one in the whole nation of China. The researchers are focused on investigating coronaviruses in the bat population. It seems clear from the genetics of this disease that it is from bats, and it's happening, closer to their level 4 biolab facility than Washington, D.C. is to Fort Detrick. So I have questions. But if you write that, Grant, to your point, I suddenly get all these fellow travelers on social media and the like that I have zero desire to be within 1,000 miles of.
Right.
And you can say the same thing about Zero Hedge. I mean, go look at the comment section on Zero Hedge. I mean, it's a sewer.
Yeah.
It's just horrific.
Your computer will crash if you go on that website. From all
your eyes start to melt when you read the comment section on Zero Hedge. So yes, one can now has so much more ability through social media and the like, and the megaphones like you have, Dimitri, with this podcast, and Grant, you and I have with what we write. So we can say things and we can speak at least our truth and our questions to power. And we can get it out there, and a lot of people will believe it. And unfortunately, right, we get both pushback from people who should be questioning it with us, and we get blanket embrace for people who just are nuts.
Right.
So it's so weird. But I'll go back to your point about what's changed today. Social media makes it easier for Grant and I to ask our questions. And we have the two-level sword of, we get the question out there in the general discussion. The negative is that it attracts lots of nuts.
Yeah.
Right. But I think what always makes for real change, and you saw this in the Vietnam War, it's when a status quo missionary, we call it in game theory, changes, flips. And the status quo missionary who everyone trusts starts to question things. In the Vietnam War, that was Walter Cronkite. Very famously, where he, I no longer believe what we were being told by, the Johnson administration. And when Johnson lost Cronkite,
so he lost middle America.
He didn't run for re-election. He lost.
That's a famous quote, by Lyndon Johnson.
Right, that's right.
But is media too fragmented these days for there to be a missionary big enough to change the narrative?
I think the missionaries have to come. They can't come from media. I think you're exactly right. I think the missionaries now have to come from politics or from commerce. Right.
So who would they be? What would be an example of that?
Warren Buffett.
Do you think so? You think he has that type of credibility?
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Absolutely. Grant and I, and I'm sure you do too, Dimitri. I mean, I've got a lot of issues with, St. Warren, right? A lot of issues. But you ask who's a mainstream missionary who, tomorrow can write whatever he wants and every newspaper in the world will publish it. And if it's, I'll say, questioning a status quo position, that becomes like, well, if Warren Buffett's saying it, I've got to take it seriously.
I see what you're saying.
Oprah.
I see what you're saying.
Oprah's
all right, there's another one.
I see what you're
Oprah.
saying.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying.
The
Or
Rock.
Obama.
Obama absolutely.
The Rock.
Absolutely.
The Rock.
Yeah. The Rock. Obama for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
But that's what it takes. You've got to have, I'll call it, a heel turn from one of those voices for things to really change.
Grant, it's so funny. One of the questions you asked, I literally had it here, but I wrote it as, how do people come together around contrarian ideas today?
Yeah.
And you mentioned Twitter. And this is a question I had for you guys, because again, in the 2008-2009 period, it was really the blogosphere that was driving some of these contrarian ideas and analysis, where you could get some thoughtful, interesting takes and educate yourself on contrarian positions. Today, it seems to be Twitter where that's happening, at least in the financial world. Is that accurate?
I think in the financial world, for sure. I mean, I think this whole idea of contrarian ideas is always fascinating to me, right? Because it really just embraces Ben's thoughts around narrative. And these days it seems to be so much easier to be contrarian because there are so many really broad themes that are embraced universally. The stock market won't go down is now, I mean, that's unquestioned nowadays.
That's the single most interesting question I have for you guys today.
I mean, the stock market doesn't go down. And if you think the stock market is overvalued, guess what? Suddenly you're a contrarian. That didn't used to be the case. If you think the stock market is pumped up on printed money, you're a contrarian now. That wasn't the case. Even back in 08, 09, when they came to the rescue of Q1, you weren't a contrarian for thinking that. So it's fascinating to me to watch how these narratives have necessarily really, the roots have gone deep now because they have to. And
it changed in 2012 and
Absolutely.
2013.
Exactly. That's when everything shifted.
That's when it shifted because I remember this so vividly. I'd go and talk to, I don't know, I'll pick a name, Lee Cooperman at Omega, right? And his team over there. And 2013, late 12, 13, talking about what I thought was going on, right? That we've got a concerted narrative to support the market, financial assets, what the Fed calls communication policy and forward guidance. And then we've got the actual large-scale asset purchases, the actual buying of stuff. And that the market we're experiencing is largely this is when I was talking about that capital markets are being transformed into this political utility.
Yeah.
And I still remember, in 2013, I mean, they couldn't laugh me out of the building fast enough. No. This is a self-sustaining economic recovery. This is just, this is the cycle. This is, real world is why the market's up. Then fast forward to, 14 or 15, and all of these, I'll call them value or fundamental active investors, they continue to have their head handed to them on a plate year after year. Then they realize, oh, well, actually, it's not a fundamental self-sustaining economic recovery. There is economic activity, but it's divorced from what's happening in asset prices. And all of our smarts, all of our efforts, all of our time, again, of the smartest people in the world, to try to make that link between fundamental activities and capital market pricing, it was worthless. It meant nothing.
Yeah.
And that realization, I think, is what transformed everything, call it from 2015 forward.
But if we wrap these two together, the coronavirus and this situation, it gels perfectly, right? Because you have 400 million people quarantined.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
that's
crazy.
The US
in
plus
China
10%.
alone.
In China alone.
That's
right?
crazy.
And the markets are at all-time highs every day. I lived in Hong Kong during SARS, and the panic in SARS, I don't think overseas was anywhere near what we're seeing with this, but locally it was pretty scary, right? I had young kids in school and everyone's wearing a mask. And I remember I had to take a Hong Kong Stock Exchange exam and I was late for it. And I was running through this deserted housing estate in Kowloon to get to where the exam was. And I'm thinking, where the hell is it? It's Saturday morning. What the hell's going on? And the Hong Kong Sevens was going on. They didn't cancel that.
Did they shut down schools?
Schools were shut down briefly, but not till May, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Shut till May.
Tell
now.
people what the Hong Kong Sevens is.
Hong Kong Sevens is the greatest party you've ever been to, as long as you are of drinking age and able to do that, because once you get too old, it's brutal. But it turned out that I'd run panting through a place called Amoy Gardens, which is ground zero for SARS. It was this housing estate that was all quarantined off. And I was kind of, that probably wasn't a great idea. And everyone around me was wearing a mask and I wasn't, because I was the stupid guilo who didn't really know what was going on. But there was never really panic about this, and people weren't really quarantined. There's a couple of housing blocks that nothing. Here we are, and the markets fell. I think Hong Kong fell 15% on the back of this thing. Here we are, almost 20 years later, 18 years later, and we have 400 million people quarantined. We have footage of people standing still and then falling flat on their faces in the street.
Right. That stuff's
we have
wild.
The spraying stuff. We have people on US evacuation flights with biological warfare kits on, not just a mask.
Yeah.
This stuff.
People getting dragged from their homes. People being. I've seen buildings getting welded shut. Stuff that it's, and you don't want to retweet it because you don't know if it's real, and you want to be responsible and everything else.
But this is in the supply chain center of the world economy.
Right.
And markets are at all-time high.
In the middle of a trade war.
It's wrong, right? The market is wrong. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the market being wrong?
See, I'll tell you, Grant, I don't think the market's wrong. I don't think the market's wrong at all. I think this is exactly what you would expect when capital markets are no longer
Okay, right, that's fair.
are no longer
Yeah.
the pricing of capital markets. It's no longer a transmission belt for investors to acquire, fractional ownership shares in real world companies, right, for them to invest and grow and the like. That meaning is gone. It's now a score. It's now a political utility, and that's what it means. That's what it means.
But if that's the
today.
case,
Doesn't that always kind of happen, though, in a way, towards the end of a bull market? It served a utility function for the Clinton administration in the late 90s.
Here's what I think is different. I think that the reason and the mechanism by which it's transformed into a political utility is that the toolkit to prop up the market against any and all deflationary shocks is overwhelming. And that's what the coronavirus is. It's a deflationary shock, just like the collapse in housing prices in the United States was a deflationary shock, just like a garden variety recession would be a deflationary shock. I don't think it is possible for markets to go down on deflationary shocks today. I think the weaponry
It's so overwhelming.
And not only the weaponry, the belief in the weaponry
Yeah, I think that's the crit.
and its effectiveness against deflationary shocks is overwhelming. Now, does that mean that the market will never go down again? No. But what it means, it's not going to go down in the same way, right? We're always fighting the last war. And the last war, the 08-09 war, was a deflationary war.
So let's talk about this a little bit, this belief, because I want to try and understand, or get closer to understanding maybe, what's driving the strength of that conviction when you have a case where you almost, we had the troops sort of suddenly pulled out of Syria and then put somewhere else. We had the unexpected assassination of an Iranian general in a part of the world that is very sensitive to oil shocks. We have the trade war. We have the coronavirus. We have all of these things, and the markets just shrug it off.
But I think this is just compounding of your point. And when you talk about it, it's the continued reaffirmation that their weaponry works to save the market. And after a while, you get to that point where you do say, this
works.
won't matter.
I mean, it's taken impact because it works, right? Investors, because it's real money at stake here, the market, the people in the market, again, this is where more brain power is devoted than any other activity on earth, right? And we, the market, are very quick learners.
But I have a question, because I want to drive this point and make it clear. Are you guys saying that the monetary tools themselves are sufficient, or maybe to Grant's point, and to your point also, the belief is ultimately what matters, and the tools are simply there to help pad this narrative that the central banks and governments will be able to save asset markets in the event of any type of deflationary shock? Because I don't know if that's actually true. If people didn't believe it, the markets would drop.
Well, I'd take you back to Hank Paulson's bazooka, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Hank Paulson assured us that you pull out a bazooka and...
We just picked a really big number.
Yeah, right? And it works. But do you think that...
Mario Draghi, summer of 2012, whatever it takes.
That's the point.
Right.
That's when everyone decided, don't fight them, join them.
But do you think the bazooka, do you think a TARP of $787 million would do the trick today?
The trick to do what?
to solve if we have another crisis. The bazooka back then is a pea shooter now.
I think any number today would actually not do the trick, because the whole point today is that
that's
it takes.
The big
exactly.
question.
Yeah,
that's the question.
Even 10 trillion would be like, wait, just 10 trillion. What if we need more?
But then you'll do more.
Yeah,
right, but
there's
then,
no limit.
But then do we get to the point which, and I may be wrong, I felt like you were alluding to, that the real problem here is inflation.
Yeah.
If that's what
that's exactly where I'm going.
Right. So
that's exactly where I'm going.
So that's
what we've built.
That 10 trillion.
Right.
Yeah, super interesting.
Right. What we've built is a Maginot Line.
Yeah.
Right. So
a what?
The Maginot Line.
Yeah.
So after World War I, the French built this impenetrable fortress on the border between France and Germany. Right. And people, laugh at the Maginot Line today. The Maginot Line worked. Right. The Maginot Line absolutely worked. It was impossible for Germany to attack France across that Maginot Line. Right. In the same way that I think it's impossible for the market to crash on some deflationary shock, because no matter how bad it is, and how could it be worse than an unknown virus that is wreaking havoc in the, you say, the heart of the supply chain of the world, right? And if that's not going to be a deflationary shock that's going to impact markets, I'm telling you, ain't nothing going to hit it, right? That doesn't mean, though, that World War II didn't happen. It meant that the German tanks went through the Ardennes forest, right? They went around. France was fighting the last war, the war of trench warfare, the war of, in the same way that we are all thinking and fighting the last war of deflation. The next war is going to be around inflation. And everybody poo-poos it, blah, blah, blah. What do you think the inflation rate is in the United States today? Right?
We don't know.
No, I'll tell you. Well, the official inflation rate in the United States today. The official, right?
Isn't it 1 point?
It's 2.5%.
Yeah, and it's been above 2 for 23 months.
For 23 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. You wouldn't think that, right? Because you're told, oh, inflation is, is non-existent, is below the Fed target. No, we've been above the Fed target for, a year and a half.
Yeah, almost 23 months.
Right.
Yeah.
So inflation is here, and that's the official inflation, right? So, don't get Grant and I started on what, real inflation is.
Yeah, your conspiracy theories. Oh, boy.
Yeah, right. So this notion that inflation is dead or gone is bollocks, right? Even on the official numbers. And yet, going into this U.S. election, going into what Europe is going to be doing, you're going to be having trillions of dollars, euros, name your currency, being spent on deficit fiscal spending, right? It's happening now. And so we're finally at a point, I say, because people were talking about this in 08 and 09, where you're going to have inflation come into the real economy, where it's not going to be limited to financial assets, but it's going to come into the real economy. And that's not going to lead to a crash in the way that a deflationary shock leads to a market crash. But there's this old country song that I love called, the line is, falling feels like flying for a little while.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's what inflation feels like. It feels like flying for a little while. And then you realize you're just falling. And that's where it's going to be. And it's going to take some years to play out, but that's the next war.
But, in China, food inflation is 5.4% now, right? And the last 3 months, food price inflation year on year, 97% in November, 116% in December, 110% in January. That's a problem right there. Food inflation in China is their worst nightmare. And it's happening, right? It's creeping higher. It is at 5.4%. What happens when the coronavirus starts feeding through food supply chains? God forbid they have any more swine flu and have to, as Louis Garve said to me when I saw him recently, they had to release a whole bunch of pork from the strategic reserve, which is known as the piggy bank, which I think is tremendous. This stuff is happening. And you're right. The inflation idea has been poo-pooed for such a long time now because it has been, right? It's been the problem that never shows up.
And it's getting your inflation environment right, generally right. You don't have to time it perfectly, but it's the single question that any asset owner, any institutional asset owner, anybody interested in preserving their family wealth, you've got to get that question. It's the only question you have to get roughly right.
So I want to go back to the point about inflation, or I want to hold it because we'll get back to it. But there are two things I want to throw out there to talk about. One briefly is, I wonder to what extent, because you're talking about inflation and food prices in China, the CCP probably knows they have a bit of a mess on their hands, one way or the other, not just the coronavirus, even before that. I don't know if I have been impressed by what I'm seeing in terms of these drones telling people to go back home and how just the power of the state to intervene in China. And I wonder how much of this might not even be about the coronavirus and how much of it is just either a reaction function of an incredibly powerful omnipotent state or omnipresent state, how much of it might be them just kind of rolling this control mechanism out, maybe taking the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, going back to that same conversation I had with Louis a couple of weeks ago, and his point, Louis Garve, and his point was spot on. He said, the most interesting thing about, and this was a couple of weeks ago, so the virus was still a little bit, it wasn't as big a deal as it is now.
Where did you release that for people that are listening?
No, this was a conversation he and I had on a panel in Phoenix, and he said, the most interesting thing about this is that the first 3 or 4 patients, we were told in 20 minutes they were at this train station at 5:07 p.m. They were in this drugstore at 7. He said, the state surveillance in China now is so sophisticated and so everywhere, and all this facial recognition and the technology that Pippa Malmgren talks about, where they can tell who you are by your gait, is terrifying. And that is one of the most interesting things to come out of this. To your point, the state, the control and the omnipresence of the state is remarkable.
But it's just smiley face over here, right? I mean, I was seeing like in your Apple Watch, in these articles about, in San Francisco, don't you want, for public health reasons, right, for your Fitbits and your Apple Watch to report what your temperature is, right? So we can track, where there's flu outbreaks and the like. So
except if the temperature goes up, they come and take you.
This is my point. This is my point.
Exactly.
These are all just variations of a Black Mirror episode, and it's got a bit more of a smiley face over here than it does in China. A lot more of a smiley face over here. But it's the same impetus. It's the same impulse. It's the same impulse, again, of the best and brightest who say, no, we want to create the story and we want to manage this. We want to manage this. And
So one of the things, I sent you guys a thread that I wrote today, and I wrote it because I was thinking about our conversation. I pulled some stuff together. I've got the usual stuff here: Tesla, WeWork.
You're always so prepared.
All that stuff.
You're amazing.
Put us to shame.
But I was thinking about, what do I really want to talk to these guys about? And this idea of nihilism, the first time this came to me was in multiple conversations that I had with Mike Green, not just on the air, but even before we did the episode. We had spent a day together from about 7 p.m. or so, having drinks in Union Square, and then ending up at a diner in Washington Square Park around 2 a.m.
They're not in brown bags. I just got the picture of you two on benches like a couple of hobos drinking out of bags.
No. We started with drinks but we ended with omelets. I actually don't remember what Mike had. I had eggs. So we were talking about this stuff, and one of the things that Mike talks about a lot is automation and this idea of learned helplessness. And this is one of the ways in which he thinks about systematic passive investing strategies. And the thing that I think about, or that I've thought about lately, is this idea of nihilism, market nihilism. And you guys, I'd love to hear your views on this, because you were more attuned and involved in the late 90s in that bull market. I was in high school at the time, but I certainly remember the euphoria. I remember my dad thinking Qualcomm was a good investment.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
it was.
It was
for a while.
It was a good investment for a while.
Falling feels like flying. For
Exactly. But there was a euphoria. There was it was the new paradigm economy.
Mm-hmm.
There was a narrative that underpinned that. There's a narrative that underpins the bull market today, but that narrative, it had a positive sort of spin to it, had a feel-good spin to it, and it felt like we were in a party. That's not what it feels like today. Today, it feels more like, markets are going up, nothing matters. The only thing that matters is the Fed. The only thing that matters is easy money. Nothing else matters. Just put your money in the market. It'll eventually go up. They'll make sure it'll go up. And even with the debt, when you're talking about, MMT, some of these theories, it's almost kind of like just burn it down. The debt, just melt it away. Let the inflation melt it so we can start over.
Don't get Ben started.
What's that about? Do you feel any of that nihilism? Do you feel that? Because I also, and I'll just say this to lead that, because I've done a number of different episodes with dealing with different stuff like this. I did one episode on my own where I read from Ted Kaczynski's Industrial Society and Its Future, his point about automation and eventually machines becoming so intelligent that they make better decisions than humans and we become dependent on them. I've done an episode with Rebecca Goldstein about mattering and how we need to matter and the importance of mattering, one with Johan Hari on depression. And there seems to be, whether it's the decline in religion or the decline in nationalism or this kind of dismemberment of the nation state, or this rise of the sort of commercialization, self-branding thing, the commoditization of the self, there seems to be a lacking in society. And I'm always careful about talking about this stuff because my subjective experience is the lens through which I view all this. I don't know how pertinent it is to everyone else, but I wonder to what extent the society, the zeitgeist, has this sense of meaninglessness and how that is perhaps being expressed in financial markets.
Can I go first?
Please. That's a fantastic question.
Two historical periods I'd point to where this feeling of helplessness has pervaded society, right? One was 1848, when Karl Marx was writing about alienation. So let me come back to that. Second was after World War I, right? The response to the Great War, the war to end all wars, which of course it wasn't. In both cases, there was a described, and what I mean by this is reading the memoirs, the stories, the found history of the people living at the time, they're expressing these ideas that you're describing today. And I really think it goes back to what Marx called alienation.
In the period after the war.
Well, for Marx, it was before these kind of wars of liberation of 1848 and the like. So when Marx was writing in his concept of alienation, that I think is, look, you can, whatever you think about Marx, I mean, I don't know of many observers of the human condition who had a keener eye.
Are we talking about Karl or Groucho?
I
just want to check because that applies to both. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
right.
it absolutely applies to both.
Exactly right.
Absolutely applies to both Karl and Groucho. But Karl's, I think, most powerful concept was that this of alienation. And it is the separation from, of course, he's talking about labor and workers. It's the separation from what a worker does and what a worker is. It's the separation of a worker from his work or her work.
An identity.
Right. When you are a cog on a machine, right, you have no connection to what you are making,
right,
to your labor. If you are a carpenter and you're making a chair, you're not alienated. I made this damn chair.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it nice? Or didn't I do maybe I did a crappy job, or didn't I do a wonderful job?
Mm-hmm.
But it is connected to who you are. Right? And what I want to suggest is that this feeling that you're describing, you're calling it nihilism, and I get that. It's what we're experiencing today is not the alienation of the factory worker. What we're experiencing is the alienation of the smartest people on earth. Because again, markets, Wall Street attracts more brain power than any other human activity. And for the last 11 years, all that smarts, all that intelligence, all that time, all that effort has been utterly, absolutely useless. You have been outperformed. You've been trounced by someone saying, oh, I'll just put it in, the US stock market, S&P 500. They have beaten you like a freaking drum. You, the master of the universe, the smartest people in the world for 11 years, who you are, your identity as, I'm a really smart guy and I've got this all figured out and I want to get the puzzle right to make a lot of money. You have failed for 11 years. This is the alienation we're describing, and you see it everywhere. I was using an example of, Lee Cooperman and Omega, I'm really not picking on them. I mean, you repeat this 1,000 times over.
Mm-hmm.
Incredibly smart people, really good at what they do, and it didn't work for 11 years. That's the alienation, because you say you do give up. You say, look, I thought I was a really smart guy, and I've been wrong for 11 years. It's that old Marxism notion of alienation, not for the downtrodden, proletariat, but for the smartest guys on earth.
You're also describing a sense of disempowerment, right? Because it sounds, what you're also describing here is that money managers, they're doing everything that they're supposed to do, and they're getting beaten by the index.
And so they get squeezed. So, Omega becomes a family office, right? I mean, right. And you don't become a family office because you want to.
So this is really interesting, though, and I want to weave in something or bring in something that I learned in a recent episode I did with Michael Lind on the new class war, because he has this thesis that it's not about money, it's about power. Because I've often talked about this or thought about this in terms of wealth and income inequality, but he talks about it in terms of an inequality in power. And his solution is one of democratic pluralism and strengthening some kind of, local institutions. That makes me also think about, again, going back to Kaczynski's Industrial Society and Its Future, his emphasis on the power process, that as humanity becomes more dependent on machines and systems and algorithms, that the process of overcoming man's or woman's process of overcoming his or her environment, the environmental forces that press upon us as we mature, that process of mastering one's environment is taken away. And what's left with is a sort of despondency, a kind of nihilism. And I wonder, again, see, when I listen to the politicians, Andrew Yang's a great example. Andrew Yang is a politician who's mimetically represents the forward-thinking, technologically conscious politician, someone that understands Silicon Valley, understands surveillance capitalism, and so his solutions are appropriate for the time. But his solutions, if you look at them are to give people a dividend. It's to simply solve the problem with just a check. And again, I wonder if our politicians are missing something fundamental. And now I'm going to go on a limb here, but I wonder if this is accounts in a major way why we have Donald Trump as president of the United States. That Donald Trump represents in part not just a vote for Donald Trump, but a nihilism that has allowed for his rise. And that is expressed in one way, for example, the low voter turnout in Iowa.
But when you said there, Andrew Yang's solution is a check, that seems to be what we've been conditioned over the last 10 years to realize, is that the answer to every problem is a check, right? Because it has been. And the checks tend to go to the same people most of the time. All he's doing is saying, I'm going to give a check to the other people who haven't been getting checks.
That's exactly correct.
But I think that's right. And it makes me wonder why Michael Bloomberg doesn't just say, okay, if you're a registered Democrat in a Super Tuesday state, sign a public pledge to vote for me and I'll just pay you $1,000.
He's getting close to that.
He's
almost there.
Why not just take out the middleman of these ads? And, why not just say, okay, I'm going to cut you a check for $1,000 if you're a registered Democrat and you pledge your support to me. I honestly think that could happen.
There was a great piece in the New York Times, I think today or yesterday, talking about
that's
his
like a Banana
campaign
Republic style.
Yeah.
This is where we would be a full-blown Banana Republic.
But
I mean,
you say that, Dimitri, but what the hell's the difference between spending a couple of $1 billion on advertising?
Yeah.
What's the difference? I actually find it more honest. Just say, here, I'm going to pay you $1,000 to vote for me.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
But I think that's a great point. So I want to let you guys continue to give some ideas. I want to throw something out here because following on what...
I just want to go back to the other period you talked about, because the parallels are interesting.
After World War I?
Right, because we had the Roaring Twenties. And that feels much more like what we're going through here, although your point is also well taken about it doesn't feel as exuberant as the 20s.
It was a new era in the 1920s.
Right. But it's the same.
I got it. But so the Roaring Twenties were absolutely a period of, I'll call it wealth creation. It's the Great Gatsby and all like that, and the wealth inequality and the like. But when you look at what people were actually writing and reading there, the despair, frankly, in the 1920s is really palpable.
Around the materialistic culture and the decline of religion?
Actually, it was the best work, there was so much written about how the immigrants who had come over here and were the parents of the guys, and it's mostly guys writing, were essentially taken advantage of politically by, the entrenched politicians with their narratives, right? That the American dream didn't work for vast numbers of people.
But I think that's my point. That's why
that is exactly
I think the parallels are much closer.
The parallels very close.
And closer to home as well as closer.
Closer to home for sure than, in 1848, what the hell was the United States? So that you can, but what Marx was writing about in kind of the French context, right?
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. It's that period of the Roaring Twenties that I find so evocative today. I think the big difference is I don't see how we have that sort of deflationary collapse that we had in the 1930s repeated today.
Sorry, I stole your question.
No. I wanted to mention Bitcoin as an interesting cultural outgrowth of this. So this point about the solution being financial. Bitcoin's interesting because it's not just an asset. It's a movement, and it's a movement whose ideology purports to present a solution to the dilemma, to the quandary in which we find ourselves. And that solution is financial. It is divesting the organs of state of the capacity to issue fiat money. And we've never, in my lifetime, I'd never seen anything like this, where a sort of a revolution was combined with money in this way. You and I have talked about this a bit in our last episode. I'm just curious how the two of you think about that in the context of this as money being the solution. Money, everything is money, money, money.
Well, I think there's always a solution that is presented, right? A lot of the times it's been religion. There's been a religious solution to the problem. A lot of the times it's been political. We happen to live in an era where even if you don't follow the stock market, even if you're not interested in finance, you have been shown that money is the solution to everything, whether it's at the Federal Reserve level or whether it's at the Instagram level. The solution to all your problems.
Now, there's an idolatry of money today.
Absolutely,
it's money and religion are sort of merging.
Yeah, but money used to be something that was desirable to have. And now it feels, even at grassroots level, it's something you have to have.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've got 2 young girls, right, who are on Instagram, and, you look at this stuff and you despair over it because I think money is the root of
the
all
younger
evil.
populations are more conscious of money.
Way more conscious.
Yeah, exactly. 100%.
Way more conscious.
Totally.
And I
totally true.
Yeah.
And it's less accessible to them today than it was to us. So it was less important to us. I mean, and we're different generations, but even to my generation, it was different to me. It was more accessible and it was less meaningful when I was a kid or when I was a young adult than it is today. Now it's even less accessible, and which I guess kind of makes sense, I
had a different experience. I want to say something off the wall here. I think the only currency in the world today is dopamine.
Yeah.
And I think that, and you talk about, Bitcoin is money. Now, I actually think what really drives Bitcoin is the dopamine of, fighting the man, right? By participating in the movement. The thrill of, I'm I'm discovering an elegant solution to this problem. These are all dopamine hits. When you look at social media, you're talking about Instagram, these are dopamine machines. It's all dopamine machines. When you talk about how it's possible for advertising to work so effectively for a Bloomberg, right? For the creation of these narratives are dopamine hits.
Mm-hmm.
That's all they are. They're just dopamine transmitters or instigators, right? So it's something I've been batting around for a long time now about how to write about this. But, this transformation in our lives, we've moved from, I'll say, owning our lives to subscribing to our lives, right? Yeah. With everything we do, you don't own a book. You subscribe to the service that provides you the book because that's a more effective dopamine hit. And honest to God, the more you kind of unpeel this onion, I feel like it's a political and commercial world that's coming around to the identification that the global currency is dopamine.
But does that mean if you can you just need to manufacture a new dopamine hit, right, to keep everything going, right?
When I write a successful article, it's because it clicks with people because the
neurons fire.
The neurons fire.
Yeah.
That's what makes for a good writer. That's what makes for a good politician. The more you think about this, you think, really the underlying currency of the world
actually,
is
this
dopamine.
is really interesting for all of us, right? Because so do you get to the point where you write in a way that is going to create the hits, or you take a podcast that is going to create the right? I mean, it's
like writing a song.
This is Alex Jones, right? I know exactly what's going to get people, either the dopamine, it's going to get them angry, it's going to get them behind me, it's going to get, and that worries me significantly because I'll be honest, I sit down and write. When I write because there's a story I want to tell.
Yeah.
And every time I write, and I don't know how you guys do this, I'll be interested in your process, but I only ever write for me. I sit down and write something that I am interested in reading, and I'm interested in getting my thoughts together, and I'm interested in, making myself chuckle as I'm doing it. And I do that deliberately because I thought about this a long time ago in this process when I was first doing it. Do I write to try and build an audience? But then how do you have control of the audience you build? If you write what you just think is interesting and you find fascinating or amusing or whatever, that's not...
I'll distinguish between, I'll call it the art and the craft of writing.
Yeah, okay.
Right? So when I'm writing a note, and I find I have a much greater appreciation for when I'm hearing a song on the radio, right? I actually listen much more now to the craft of writing the song, right? Where's the hook? Where's the melody? Where did they put that in? Oh, that's an interesting riff that you put in here. Why did you make this choice rather than that choice, right? And I think about writing notes in the same way. And it's something that's emerged over time where there are rules for creating a note that is going to click with people. And I want it to click with people because I want to get my idea out there.
No, sure. Absolutely.
Right? I mean, and I...
This is why you're a way better writer than me, by the way.
But it's like there is a logic to this. It's why I named my company Second Foundation Partners, right?
Asimov.
Which is the old Asimov. Harry Seldon says, no, there's a math to human communications. And there really is. All I'm saying is, and Asimov didn't know about this, the metric of that math is dopamine, right?
Yeah.
And different words I write and different ways of expressing them, I know it will generate a certain dopamine hit. And I really think that when people write songs, that when politicians give speeches, the craft of it, how you're putting it together to get your idea across, it's, your talent at creating a dopamine.
But that's interesting, right? Because you can use that power for good or evil, and you happen to use it. You happen to use it for good, right?
I hope
for the most part. There are a few raccoons who might disagree with me, right? And you use it for good. You're trying to get that information out there, but it does show you. I mean, I hadn't thought of dopamine as a currency, but I think you're absolutely right. But it does give you a fascinating window into how easy it is for extreme politicians to gain traction in the world.
It changes. So this is why the political parties are dying.
Yeah.
Right. Is why Michael Bloomberg can basically, hire, well, that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to rent the Democratic Party in the same way that Trump bought the Republican Party, right? Because parties used to be that transmission mechanism for identity and what you know about somebody. Now, today, it's money and fame. Money and fame, right? Those are the things that generate dopamine responses in people.
But it also explains why they're doing this, right? Why they're polarizing to.
Yes, you moved your fingers apart here on radio, so a podcast.
So, guys, I want to continue this conversation and move it into the overtime before we, and especially this part about this is fascinating. One of the things I actually wanted to ask you guys was about your career as publishers, sort of as also survivors of financial markets.
Yeah.
Before we head in, I just want to tease something which I want to discuss on the other side of this, which is to go back to Bitcoin. I want to suggest perhaps that maybe the narrative that you put forward is, yes, that's the narrative of Bitcoin, but it doesn't have the oomph, to quote Jim Grant. It doesn't have the power that it once had. Similarly, perhaps Tesla doesn't have the oomph that it once had as a narrative of the green revolution. And so all of these things, perhaps they rely more on price today than they used to. And so again, to bring us back to, the importance of it going up, the price going up, I wonder how important that is. And you've talked about this wonderfully with Donald Trump.
You talk about craft. This is a craft right here. Saving Bitcoin and Tesla for the overtime.
Yeah, right.
You, my friend.
I love you.
You, my friend.
I love you. Listen, I love you.
Podcast craft. Exactly.
All right.
Right.
So for regular listeners, you know the drill. If you're new to the program, or if you haven't subscribed yet to our audio file, autodidact, or super nerd tiers, head over to patreon.com/hidden forces or scroll down to the bottom of the summary text for this week's episode and link through to that page where you can also find instructions for how to integrate the Overtime RSS feed into your podcast application of choice so you can listen to this conversation just like you listen to the regular episode. Guys, we'll be right back. Hang in there. Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded at Creative Media Design Studio in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/hidden forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.